I'm Gareth Vaughan, and I'm joined by Professor Steve Keen, who's a professor of economics and a staunch critic of the mainstream. Welcome to interest.co.nz, Steve, and thank you for your time. First of all, we're going to talk obviously about the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impacts of it and how policymakers can respond to it. But first of all, just be interested to hear where you are during this crisis and why.
Okay, well, I became aware of this crisis about late December, early January, because I follow people who are specialists in epidemiology, and one of them is also a critic of mainstream economics, runs a blog called Peak Prosperity. This is Chris Martinson, has a PhD in, not in epidemiology, but in a related medical field. And he was warning about this rapidly, extremely contagious, that's the main problem, extremely contagious, probably a fairly virulent disease as well. So right from the end of December, I was watching it. And the mathematics of the rate of growth of it just said this is going to be a pandemic. And initially, I had a choice of 4 countries to live in: the UK, where I'm a resident; Australia, where I'm a citizen; the Netherlands, where I have a house; and Thailand, where my partner is a national, though she lives in Amsterdam. And until literally about 4 weeks ago, I was thinking it'd be Amsterdam, because that's where we have a house. But Amsterdam's numbers simply exploded, or rather Holland's numbers exploded, while Thailand was flatlining relatively. And I finally decided the safest place to be, both for statistical reasons and because of research showing that heat and humidity degrade the virus much more rapidly than low temperatures, we decided to move to southern Thailand. So we're currently living in the town of Trang, which is 850 kilometres south of Bangkok. And it's not a tourist area. If any tourism, it's local Thai tourism, not international. So there's a total of 6 cases in this province, which is far less than any suburb of Sydney right now, and of course far less than anywhere in Europe. So I came here for safety, and I hope it works.
Sounds like a good plan. Look, now obviously COVID-19 is sweeping the world, ripping through lots of countries. It's obviously lots of people, as you say, very contagious. Lots of people are getting it. People are dying, certainly in larger numbers in some countries than others. I guess there's still an awful lot of uncertainty out there in terms of how long it's going to last before it's under some sort of control, and we don't know how bad it's ultimately going to be. But we are seeing in the meantime, I mean, governments are throwing a lot of money around. Central banks are ramping up their balance sheets once again. I mean, here in New Zealand, our government has given itself capacity to borrow up to 52 billion so far. Our Reserve Bank is doing a quantitative easing program of 33 billion, which in a New Zealand context, these are decent numbers. Do you think governments are going about this the right way?
Better than they have beforehand, because the whole idea that governments can't service their own debt when they issue that debt in their own currency is simply stupid. It's a fixation which has come out of mainstream economics, which effectively has a commodity or a corn economy view of the world. And so, if you want to be safe in the future, you hoard corn now. And then when the crisis hits, you can drag the corn out of the warehouse and you're okay. We don't use corn for money. We never have. The whole idea of a barter economy is a mainstream economic myth. And what we actually have is a monetary economy, and there are fundamentally 2 ways you can create money. Banks create money by lending out more than they get back in repayments, and the government creates money by spending more than it gets back in taxation. Now, the government can service that debt completely because the government is the only institution in a national economy that owns its own bank. And if you think about the Treasury actually is the effective owner of the central bank. So any profits made by the central bank on bonds that it owns is repaid to the Treasury. And you can literally, it's quite technically possible, there's nothing technically preventing this. The Treasury could issue, in New Zealand's case, say $100 billion worth of bonds. The Reserve Bank could buy that $100 billion worth of bonds. It would credit the Treasury's deposit account, either in its own bank or if some countries use a private bank for it, credit that bank account with $100 billion, and then that $100 billion could be spent by the Treasury. There's nothing preventing that happening technically whatsoever. It's simply the impact that might have in terms of inflation, the big bogey of inflation. But at the moment, what we face is deflation and probably a total collapse of the monetary system. So the government should be doing this. I'm glad they've started to do it. They simply haven't gone far enough yet.
Okay. We've also, in New Zealand, we've got over 1 million people now on government wage subsidies. So obviously, government is helping to prop up businesses, keep people in work. As we discussed already, we don't know how long this is going to last. Do you think that once we are on the other side of this, and whenever that may be, are we going to return to the pre-COVID-19 world, or is the world going to be fundamentally different? And if so, how?
It'll be fundamentally different. I know there'll be a lot of people who try to push us back to that world. But if you want to have one word that characterises the world we live in now, it's a creditor world. It's a world where interests of creditors come first and interests of debtors come second. And that is a world which has always led ultimately to a crash, to a failure, because the creditors effectively lend too much money during good times, insist on it being repaid during bad times, and you get a ratcheting up effect of the level of private debt until such time as people can no longer afford to borrow money and you go into a slump. That's what actually caused the global financial crisis back in 2008. And it's also what caused the collapse of the Roman Empire. We know that Jesus did not say, forgive us our sins. He said, forgive us our debts. He was a campaigner for a debt jubilee. All these things, we need to reduce the level of private debt and make debtors, or make the mass of the population, because most people are debtors, not creditors. We need to make the society work for the mass rather than the minority. Now, of course, the minority are politically powerful. They have the ears of most governments. They will try to push us back to that world. We have to stop them, because if we don't, we will end up in a financial contagion following from the coronavirus contagion.
So what is the solution? I mean, I know in the past you've talked about a debt jubilee. Is that an idea that you would advocate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Again?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of a debt jubilee is something, again, the word jubilee, I mean, its roots are in Judaic language. The first jubilees went back to the time of ancient Sumeria. And the reason was simple. It was a forgiveness of household debts. Corporate debts were not forgiven. But what would happen with household debt, and frankly, a lot of those debts were run up in mead halls or alcohol halls. We know this, so you'd get in debt to the publican. When you're drinking in the off-harvest period, when the harvest came on, you'd try to repay. You wouldn't manage to repay a lot of what people would manage to repay. You become a debt slave. You'd lose your land and you'd lose your liberty to the landlord. And then what that meant was the number of free men who were available to fight to defend the empire against attacks from the outside would decline. And the emperor was faced with a choice of either losing the empire or getting rid of the landlords. And what initially they actually executed a lot of the landlords and liberated the debt slaves. Then it became institutionalized. So every 49 years or every change of empire, change of emperor, there was a debt jubilee. Now that's the old-fashioned way to go about it. We can't do that today, but we can do what I call a modern debt jubilee, and that's use the government's capacity to create fiat money to distribute an equal amount of money per person across the entire country. And people who are in debt would get their debts reduced either by an offset account or by actually paying their debts down. People who are not in debt get a cash injection. And that cash injection can also be used, as I argue, to buy newly issued corporate shares, which are used to pay down private debt. So as well as reducing household debt, you reduce corporate debt and you also democratise the ownership of the corporations. So it's quite feasible to do it. I never thought it would ever happen. People ask me what chance it have of this happening. I'd say it's less than a snowflake's chance in hell. We are in hell now. And the only way out of hell is as well as getting a vaccine for the virus, is to reduce this burden of private debt. Otherwise, we'll have a financial collapse after the coronavirus collapse.
The way you're setting it out there, so it's a case of government money being used to pay down private debt. So that means the debtors aren't they're not defaulting on their loans.
That's right. If you don't do it, otherwise they will default on their loans. One of my favourite people and close colleagues in this whole area is a man called Michael Hudson, and he has a very simple phrase, and that is that debts that can't be repaid won't be repaid. I at the addendum, we've got to work out how you're not going to pay them. If you insist on the debts being paid, you get the travesty of the 19th century debtor prisons, where people were thrown into prison and you had to pay money to punish them for the fact that they couldn't pay their debts. You simply have to accept that debts can't be repaid when too much debt has been issued. And our banking sectors have gone on an absolute ridiculous level of pumping up private debt, largely pumping up housing bubbles, and trying to fool us that that's actually good for us. It's anything but. So we have to reduce private debt, and we have to do it now.
So in New Zealand, the banks here are offering mortgage deferrals during this pandemic with the approval of the government and the Reserve Bank, which through which people whose incomes are hit by COVID-19 are allowed to have a mortgage deferral for 6 months.
Yeah.
So would you advocate then that when that period's up, the government should pay the debt off on behalf of those borrowers?
I think we should do a debt jubilee now. Okay, I'm not going to wait till we get through this crisis, because if we don't have a debt jubilee now, there'll be many people who can't pay their rents as well as not being able to pay their mortgages. It's not only rent, you have to think about renters as well as thinking about mortgagees, mortgagors here. So if we do it now, we will enable the payment system to continue functioning. If we don't do it now, then it's quite possible the payment system will collapse. Small businesses won't get any cash income. Households won't get wages. Everybody will end up having no money in their bank accounts, okay? Because that money will be used to pay off debt, cancel debt. They will cancel the money as well. Or you'll get people paying their rents for 1 or 2 months and then they can't pay it anymore. They're only going to defer the inevitable for a couple of months. We have to do it now.
We've also got predictions, and I think we're well on the way in a lot of countries around the world now to double-digit unemployment. How do you think the world of employment is going to look the other side of COVID-19?
Well, I hope one thing that's going to come through is the idea of a universal basic income, because one thing we forget is that to have a functioning economy, you have to have people spending money, and most people get their money to spend from their wages. And that therefore means they're dependent upon having a wage income. Now, that's fine most of the time, but this is not most of the time. The only way we're going to defeat this virus is by an effective lockdown process. It could take, if it was done sensibly, as little as 5 weeks of lockdown to terminate this virus. But we have possibly 70% of the population can't afford not to work for 5 weeks. Now, in that situation, the only way to remedy it is to say, let's use the government's money creation capability so that all the payments that are necessary, including rents and mortgages, can be made over that 5-week period. And then we can get through this, what effectively happens, the economy is in a coma. And we're expecting the cells within that body to continue functioning while the body itself is in a coma. It doesn't work that way.
Now, obviously, globalization was already under pressure in this time of Donald Trump as the US president and the trade war with China, Brexit, etc. Where do you see globalization post-COVID-19 and tourism as well? Because air travel's dead right now.
Yeah, well, so globalization, thank God, will go into reverse, because it was always a bad idea in the first place. It's touted by economists as efficiency and exploiting countries' comparative advantage. That is the greatest load of bullshit in terms of economic theory ever invented, because one essential element of the theory of comparative advantage is you can easily allocate your resources from one industry in which you have a lower comparative advantage to another in which you have a higher comparative advantage. And the examples are always given of moving workers from one industry to another. So you retrain sheep workers to become vignerons. Sure, okay, that's not so difficult. But how do you retrain a sheep dip to become a wine press? Okay, you simply can't do it. The capital that is used to make these commodities is not mobile between industries. And it was a myth perpetrated by Ricardo and not overturned by mainstream economists after that, to pretend that capital was mobile, it is just as mobile as labour. Effectively, they confuse financial capital, which they don't understand in the first place, with physical capital. So you don't get the so-called gains from trade by reallocating your resources. What you did out of globalization was exploiting low wages in third world countries. Of course, that's benefited those countries themselves. China's industrialized dramatically on the back of that. They've done very, very well. But we've deindustrialized the West. And now, of course, what do we need? We need industrial capacity to produce, for example, ventilators. which even America can't do sufficiently itself. So we have to go to a localized production system. And if you'd had biologists advising how to design the economic system, they would have pushed for a cell-based production system. You get a region that is large enough to produce most of its needs for itself, and then you have the world divided in a number of regions of that nature. Obviously, New Zealand and Australia might be one such region. And with that combination, you don't need a great deal of imports and exports from other countries. You might exchange ideas rather than actual commodities. There's far less pollution from international trade, and there's also far less mobility for a virus to spread. Now, instead, what we've done is globalized everything. The Apple iPhone, for example, has components made in 43 countries. As soon as the virus hits, it smashes the world, and that's what we've done.
I just lost you for a while there, but we'll push on. You're back now.
Yeah.
Just in this world of globalization going into reverse, I guess, do you not see a bit of a danger? I guess we've heard a lot about America first in recent years, tensions rising between superpowers. I guess the worst case scenario is a sort of 1930s scenario where the big powers are all looking out for themselves and they end up at war. Is there any danger of going down that path?
What actually caused the war in the 1930s was austerity. Okay, what gave rise to Hitler was austerity imposed upon the German population. When Americans insisted that bonds that Germany had sold to American investors had to be repaid, that wiped out the German economy virtually overnight, gave it the highest level of unemployment in the world at the time, and that's what led to the rise of Hitler. So it wasn't global. It wasn't the Hawks Motley Bill and protectionism. It was austerity, and that's what set up the level of hatred and racism we see these days as well. That's led to blame the victim type mentality. It's led to services being curtailed and people complaining about bad services, and that itself leading to having a right-wing reaction. So it's austerity that caused the problems back then. It's austerity that's caused them today, particularly in Europe. So if we go back to having a regional system where we do it deliberately to enable one region not to infect another in terms of diseases like the coronavirus, then it's done for a positive reason rather than for a negative one of autarky, which is the way that it's normally portrayed by conventional economists.
Now, in this post-COVID-19 world, this picture of this world that you're painting, the possibilities, where do you see New Zealand placed in that?
Well, actually, New Zealand, you're a very lucky country. Unlike Australia, where lucky country actually is a subtext for saying a country which relies on luck to make up for its mediocre management. You have a superb range of climates. You have some fabulous engineering, and you have the capacity to produce most of your needs domestically, even though you're a very small population. You're a small population in a small area, so you can get reasonable economies of scale out of that. I think you can be pretty self-sufficient, and you also, there's good reason why lots of billionaires are buying farms with landing strips in New Zealand. Not necessarily good reasons to let them land, but they know what they're doing. So in terms of countries that are relatively safe as we approach a global warming catastrophe, and the coronavirus is part of that, not just the warming, but the excessive impact humans have upon the planet, I think New Zealand is well located, well placed, and it should take advantage of that. Gareth, I want to show a couple of charts just for your New Zealand view, if that's okay. Yeah. So I'm going to do a share screen here, and just you might cut this in possibly, but I just want to share this and show you what people don't normally understand. That chart, as you can see, I hope can you see the text at a reasonable scale, or should I make it larger?
Yes, that looks good. Yep.
Okay, there is your level of private debt. Now, all the neoclassical economists obsess about government debt. That's the level of private debt that they ignore. You went from 30% of GDP as your private debt level back in the 60s and 70s to 210% virtually after the global financial crisis. Now you're dragging along at about 180% of GDP. That's a fairly common experience in most of the rest of the world. That is why we have a financial crisis coming our way, because you are literally 7 times as indebted now, or 6 times as indebted now as you were back in the 60s. And so unless we reduce that from there right down to here, we're going to have people going bankrupt in a matter of days or weeks, whereas back here they would have lasted months. And to show you, it's mainly household debt. Okay, your corporate debt has been falling for some time. Your household debt is lower than Australia's, but still extremely high. This has all been used to drive up house prices to make people think they're prosperous because of rising house prices. That is the unconscionable debt we should never have allowed to happen in the first place. Notice it rose from 30% back in 1990 to virtually 100% today. And that is all money that has simply inflated house prices. It's done nothing productive for the economy. It's been irresponsible lending by the banks, and it has to end.
Well, look, thanks a lot for your time, Steve. That's Steve Keen, who's a professor of economics and a staunch critic of the mainstream.